So welcome to this event. This is the third in a series of the WISERD organized events on the foundational economy. This afternoon session is about the role of national projects on the foundational economy, and we are very happy to have two speakers, not three, because Richard Wynne-Jones will not is not with us. So the first speaker is Professor James Mitchell from the University of Edinburgh, and the second speaker will be Professor David Edgerton from King's College London. James Mitchell and the two speakers, they will have 20-25 minutes each, and at the end of the two speeches, Kevin Morgan will comment on the topics raised, having the perspective of trying to frame topics raised from the viewpoint of Wales. And well, a couple of things about the title and the topic, the slant that we choose for this afternoon session. The idea of national project, it's quite challenging for the foundational economy, because I mean, we could so to speak identify a couple of steps in the evolution, so to say, of the foundational economy research project. The first one was the vertical or sectorial analysis of key foundational sector, for instance, trains, motorways, transports, and so on and so forth. The second step was about it still is much about that, so to say, radical social innovation at the local level. But there is a third step, and this is the focus of today's session. There is a need to focus more the foundational economy at the macro level, and with a special focus on the role of the state at the national level. So I mean, today's session is about that, and we are very looking forward to the two speeches to frame the foundational economy in this direction. So the title of James Mitchell's speech is Reversing the Lens, while David Edgerton's speech is The Opportunities and Dangers of a New National Political Economy. I will leave James, you have, as I said, 20-25 minutes for your speech, and then we will listen to David for the other 20-25 minutes. So please, James, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I'm trying to share my screen, and there we are. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak to you. I was a wee bit nervous when I was first asked to talk to this conference, because I'm not an economist. I didn't know much about the foundation economy. I'd heard of it, but I'm very grateful that it was brought to my attention. So I'm grateful to Kevin for the invitation and encouraging me to go and look at the work. I read the book, the Foundational Economy book, with great interest, and I found that there was so much in it that spoke to me and spoke to my interest, more so than I expected, to be honest, though that really tells you more about my ignorance than anything. And there was a lot in it that I could have picked out and used as a theme for this afternoon's talk. I chose one particular point made early on in the book, and that's that quotation you can see before you. And it talks about what is basic and foundational is always likely to be taken for granted, and as a result neglected, until we notice that much of it has slipped away and become very difficult to replace. That comment, I think, speaks very much to many of us who work on public policy, and to illustrate that point, I've taken another quotation from a different book from one of my colleagues, Peter John, Analysing Public Policy, And on the first page of his book, he kind of makes the point about the kind of much of politics is about the effervescence, the fizziness of politics, the grand stories, the kind of comments made in Parliament, who's up, who's down, and so on and so forth. And we tend to neglect matters that really affect our citizens, the kind of issues that are fundamentally important, but often banal, not boring, banal in the sense that they're everyday, but crucial to the life chances, welfare, well-being of people. And it's those matters that I think are often neglected, forgotten, at least until they are perceived to be failing us, and then there's a huge crisis, and we maybe start to address them. But for the most part, they don't take as much attention in our politics, as I would certainly argue, as they deserve. And I want to ask, in a sense, couple of questions. The first is, why is that the case? And I'm going to particularly focus on Scotland, and I think there's a particular dimension to this in Scotland, but there are also many points I hope to make that will speak to other places as well, because I don't think it's peculiar to Scotland that we have this problem. Clearly, in terms of the foundational economy book, that would appear to be the case. The other question I want to try to consider and address is the extent to which the pandemic may have altered things. Have things changed? And crucially, I think, if they have changed, whether those changes will become embedded, or will we go back to the old ways, as it were. So that's the kind of key question and questions I want to address. And I want to take Scotland, as it were, as a case study in that, acknowledging there are some very distinctive things about Scotland, but ultimately I think actually many of the issues that we confront, and many of the problems we have, are very, very common elsewhere. So I want to start by talking about kind of what I would say are conception misconceptions, how we understand politics and these matters. In Scotland, we've got this Scottish question, as I've called it in the past, that dominates so much of our politics, and it's really got a number of parts to the Scottish question, and they all interlink. There is the constitutional question, and I want to suggest that part of the problem we've got in Scotland is that the constitutional question is conceived in incredibly narrow terms. It's really a debate about whether Scotland should be independent, about relationships with the rest of the UK. And not even actually that latter part, it's really about whether we should be independent. It's been very difficult, for example, for those who advocate change, but within the United Kingdom, to get their voice heard because of the very Manichaean, adversarial nature of the politics, particularly since the independence referendum. But I would go much further than that. It's not just that the constitutional question is very narrowly conceived in that sense. Other matters have been largely ignored or omitted. The relationship between Parliament and executive levels, the role of local government and local institutions, which I think are fundamental to the issues that we would be interested in terms of the foundational economy, the kind of everyday public policy matters that concern me. And so I think when we look at that aspect of the Scottish question, we've got a bit of a problem here because of the narrowness of the debate. Just speaking beforehand about the announcement that's been made with regard to adult social care in Westminster and how it's been framed and seen in Scotland. Well, it's inevitably been seen in terms of, well, is this Westminster doing us down, or how much we're going to get from them? Why this should make the case for independence or against independence? That's largely how that issue of huge importance has been seen, rather than the many other dimensions to it. How do we deliver in our communities that welfare that we seem to be approaching a consensus on the need for? Another aspect of the Scottish question is kind of party political, which of course is related to the constitutional question and the kind of dominance of a very sharp party political debate. The fascinating thing about Scotland is that it's very British. It's more British than the rest of Britain in many respects in terms of our party politics, in as much as it's very adversarial. And I think that has inhibited a better debate on many of those issues. Identity is another huge issue, and of course that relates to the constitutional question. Are we Scottish, are we British, or some mixture? We don't tend to look at the role of local identities. We tend to think about this in a very, again, a limited way, and a limiting way, in my view. And consequently, I think that many of the everyday public policy issues tend to be neglected, and if considered at all, they tend to be conceived through those lenses that I've been talking about. And so many of the big tricky issues, the wicked problems, the foundational issues, everyday public policy tend to be neglected. And there's a tendency, and I think this is common not just in Scotland, this is common across many countries, that when it comes to party politics, there is an assumption that all you need to do is pass a piece of legislation, get a ministerial statement, you pull a lever, and change happens. I think we don't quite have the full appreciation that that's just the start of the process, and it's incredibly difficult. Even if there's lots of money, even if there's going to be lots of money coming for adult social care, for example, how it's actually delivered on the ground, that long process of implementation, and I'll come back to that later, is neglected. I've got a picture here of the late John P. Mackintosh up, and part of the reason is I've been looking at his papers a lot recently, both his own private papers in the National Library of Scotland, but also in the National Archives of Scotland, because I think some of his thinking on some of these issues is really worth revisiting. Mackintosh was an academic. He was a professor of politics at Strathclyde and Edinburgh University. He died in 1978. He was also a very independent-minded Labour Member of Parliament for Berwick and East Lothian, the constituency I actually now live in. And throughout his career, both as an academic and as a politician, he made the point that we needed to recognise the local dimension. And he talked about the revival of local self-government. Many people today associate him with devolution, as a great supporter of devolution. But in fact, he frequently made the point that to look at constitutional issues, i.e. that is defined in terms of devolution independence, alone was a mistake. There was no dividing line between the constitution and local government. And so we needed that fuller appreciation. And anybody who looks at his papers and sees the kind of work he was doing and all sorts of issues, local issues, which haven't really attracted much attention, can see that he had that much fuller understanding of these issues that I think have been, if you like, marginalised. They've been forgotten. And to take us back to that first point from the foundational economy book. So I think we do need to kind of move on and try to consider why we're not able to do this. I think there are a number of reasons. I think what we've got in British politics and Scottish politics, not any different, frankly, is a kind of performative politics, but we're very poor in terms of policy performance, in terms of improving outcomes. I've always found it amusing, or that's the wrong word actually, irritating, that the Scottish Parliament was established to be different, and yet it is just so similar to the House of Commons. The one thing we imported into the Scottish Parliament was First Minister's questions, which is really a direct link to Prime Minister's questions, which is neither a good way of scrutinising government nor anything else, really, frankly. But of course, it adds to that kind of performative nature, that kind of adversarial politics, that focus on matters that attract media attention and so on and so forth, but don't really get to the everyday banal but important matters of public policy. And of course, I think related to that, I don't entirely agree with everything that Jerry Miller says in his book on metrics, but I think, we do focus on many metrics that are not significant. We focus on inputs, how many policemen we're going to have, how many nurses we're going to have. Rather than outcomes, we focus on things like the waiting times in hospitals. We don't actually focus so much on health improvement. And I find that really, really rather sad. There's certainly a lot of good language, and if you listen to the First Minister, and this is true of all political parties in Holyrood, the values they espouse are very good, but values don't drive policy. They're revealed in the policy process, as Rudolf Klein once said. I think that's a key point. What is actually happening on the ground? Is it changing outcomes? It's not just about inputs or outputs, it's about outcomes. And in that respect, I don't think we're doing very well at all in Scotland or in the rest of the United Kingdom. And I think part of the reason is the kind of nature of our politics. So, has the pandemic made a difference? There's been a lot of work being done on this, and I found one of the most interesting reports on this was the House of Lords report. It's a Public Services Committee report some time back, way back in November of 2020, and it talked about a critical juncture. That would imply that we're seeing a big change, and we're going to move in a new direction. A critical juncture isn't just a sudden change. It implies it's going to become embedded, it's going to be a new route, and then we're going to stick to that route into the future. And they outlined some key weaknesses in the current system that it felt, the authors of this report felt, were being addressed. Now, I'm not going to go through them, but suffice to say, they're very, very much ones that we've all heard before. And if you look at the list from the House of Lords report, and then the list below it, which is a list from a report that was produced 10 years ago by the commission that I was a member of on the delivery of public policy in Scotland, you can see the very great similarities. 10 years ago, the Christie Commission in Scotland, looking at how we deliver public services, made the case for significant change in the way in which we deliver services in Scotland. We argued for a more empowered communities and individuals. That, in a sense, was implicitly a criticism of the very paternalistic top-down approach that had been adopted over many, many years in so many services, not all, but so many services. And secondly, again, another theme, not new, was that we needed more partnership, more integration. We tended to do things in silos. We needed to join up. And if you want to find one area that is most certainly true, then look at adult social care. But there are so many other areas where that's the case. Third kind of key theme that we argued for was a great shift to prevention. As one health minister once said to me, we're really good at putting together bodies that fall off the cliff. We're pretty poor at stopping them falling off in the first place. And again, I think that reflects the kind of politics I was talking about earlier. We really need to have that kind of shift to prevention. That's not easy, but it has to be done if we are to really affect and improve the life chances of our people. Moving toward a much more efficient system in terms of delivering public services. Essentially, I'm arguing here is that we need to have a much more kind of bottom-up approach to how we understand these issues and to get to grips with some of those wicked problems. Otherwise, we can talk a good game, but we're not really delivering very much. But has the pandemic altered things? I think it has, and over the last 18 months, it's been very difficult for those of us who research this area to really know what's going on, because, I mean, I've been doing all my research from this room and hardly been out and about in the way that I would normally do. But I've had many meetings, I've chaired meetings and engaged with people in public services at grassroots, including Stephen Boyle here and his outfit, the Audit Scotland. And I think I'm very much in agreement with Stephen's view and the research that Audit Scotland has done. Audit Scotland was set up when devolution was established to audit public bodies and to make recommendations. I have to say that one of the things I think we've done really well in Scotland is Audit Scotland. Initially, I think they took a fairly narrow understanding of audit. It was very financially driven, and that's important. But I think in recent times, they've developed that and understood the importance of outcomes, and that many things simply, that are important can't be counted. You can't quantify. And I think Stephen, who's just recently taken up the post, his predecessor, Caroline Gardner, has made a huge impact in that respect and pushing in this direction. And this is a blog that Stephen put up yesterday, and I found it really interesting and useful. And he talks, I guess, some of the points I'm making about the implementation gap between policy ambitions and delivery on the ground. I tend to be a wee bit ruder about that and say there's a great rhetoric reality gap, that the politicians talk a good game but they don't really deliver. We've got this great idea of where we want to go. Everybody has signed up to Christie and the principles, all the political parties and all the rest of it. This is the so-called Scottish model, but are they actually delivering? And I'm very much of the view, and the research I've done, and certainly what Scotland has done, has raised questions about that gap. But he notes, and I think this is really interesting, and from what I can see from where I'm sitting, and I think this requires further proper research, is that actually many of the things that we recommended were actually implemented during the pandemic, that there was a far greater willingness to take account of communities, views, and indeed I think the partnership working at local level between volunteers, third sector, local public bodies has been remarkable, and there has been a great deal done that would not otherwise have been done. And the reason, as he rightly said, is because, well, it was a matter of life and death. It was that important. We had to move in that direction. And many of the very restrictive approaches were abandoned. I think some of the risk aversion that is endemic in our institutions was thrown aside, and we just got on with things. And that's certainly my strong sense. The question, though, is whether we can carry this on, whether we can continue with this approach. He is a bit more optimistic than I am, has to be said. I'm pretty pessimistic on where we're going. I think the chances are that we will go back, we will revert to old ways, and I do that. I say that not with any great pleasure, but I think the main reason, and is probably summed up by Machiavelli, in that wonderful and famous quotation, it's very difficult to carry out significant change. You know, challenging interests, institutions, institutional interests, and so on. And I think, you know, what we have in Scotland is an interesting Scottish model, as they call it, but actually it hasn't really been fully implemented. And hence, I think the problems that we face today remain very much the same problems that we had 20 years ago. And indeed, for a variety of reasons, and COVID is going to make this much worse. We're seeing, for example, the gap between the life chances of the rich and the poor in Scotland actually growing in the last few years. And unless and until something is done about that, I think that growth will continue, that gap will continue to grow. So it's not just an implementation gap that we have in Scotland. So apologies in many respects for a fairly pessimistic approach, but my strong view is that much that we talk about and much that will be brought to your attention about Scottish politics in Scotland misses the point. I think that so much is debated that is narrowly conceived, it's top down, and it does allow us actually to feel good without having to do very much. That's probably I'm probably slightly exaggerating that point for effect, but I do think that we do need to take note of where we are post this pandemic and seriously learn lessons. But in the last few days in Parliament, I'm not convinced that's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your for this speech. And I think we could go directly to the second speech by David Edgetor, and then save comments and questions at the end after Kevin Morgan comment. So David, please. You don't have slide, don't you?
No, no, I don't. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm a historian rather than economist or political scientist, but today I really want to reflect on some political questions, some contemporary political questions around the relationship of the nation and the foundational economy. And I want to start with the following observation, that is that we've seen an extraordinary politicization of the economy and society, a democratization also in many forms. I mean, in the Anglo-American world, we have Trump, Brexit, Sanders, and Corbyn, who have all in their different ways made a discussion of many topics possible once again. Now, the relationship between what's happening on the ground and politics is very complex. But what we see now is at least outlines of connections between political positions and changes in our economy and society. We have a democratic revival engaging in all these discussions. Now, this may seem a very odd position to take. It's actually not my own. I owe this to Anthony Barnett, but I think he's fundamentally right that there is a re-engagement of people with economic, social, political realities. I mean, it's a gory process, a very unsatisfactory process, but it's going on. Now, all this politics, this politicization has taken place very largely, as it's bound to, in a national frame. The national is being opened up in fresh ways. In the case of the UK, the national and Brexit are obviously connected. But I think we need to be careful there. To see the Brexiter programme as a nationalist response and a critique of a globalized world is tempting, but I think misleading. While Brexit proponents were clearly culturally nationalist, they are continuing the globalizing Thatcherite rulers' revolt. they believe, and I think this is very important to recognize, that the UK has been revived by Thatcherism, hence the talk of science superpowerdom and global Britain. It's a success story, paradoxically, within the EU. The Brexiters are radical free marketeers, hence the emphasis on free ports, on deregulation, on new free trade deals, and their insistence that we need generally to reduce trade barriers. Now, there's an obvious response to this, which is in fact that they have put up trade barriers with Europe. But we need to recognize this is not what they hoped. Those barriers are rather a measure of their misunderstanding of realities, not a consequence of what they argued for. Now, having said that, they have managed to look more nationalist than ever and have seemed to have convinced people, including some on the left, that they are serious about levelling up, about reducing inequality across the United Kingdom, and that they're also serious about regenerating British industry. The reality, from my point of view, is that levelling up is a pork barrel sham, and that the overthrowing of the 2017 industrial strategy is just one indicator of their profound free market inclinations. Of course, we also have the case of COVID to throw in alongside. And the emergency measures around COVID have reinforced the picture of Brexit and the Johnson government as transformative. Some, again on the left, came to believe, at least during the early stages of COVID, that the government was conducting a new kind of politics. One historian described it as social democracy on steroids. But lavish emergency money for business, for the financial system, the propping up of asset prices, is not, at least in my reckoning, social democracy. One only has to look at the notable reluctance to increase sick pay or to expand the scope of the NHS to see this. COVID has in fact been an opportunity to further privatize healthcare, and in its effects and in the responses to it has resulted in increased inequality rather than equality. Furthermore, despite cultivated impressions to the contrary, the UK's success in vaccination, lasted terribly long, relative success, comes not from native innovation in manufacture, but from the purchase of some half of all its vaccines from the EU and a small quantity from India. The Pfizer vaccine came from the EU, as did some of the AstraZeneca, and now other stuff is coming in from the US and elsewhere. The United Kingdom has not exported, as far as I know, a single vial of vaccine. The world's major exporters, in fact, being the EU. So far from being a generous supplier to the world, the UK has been a net importer. Its success in vaccination is due to its ability to import and not to make. It is not even self-sufficient in vaccines. In short, Brexit realities and the COVID response, for all their overt nationalism, have not, I think, been directed at creating a more national, let alone a more caring economy in reality. Contrary to, I'd hear, contrary to naive accounts of British history, war and other calamities do not necessarily lead to social democracy. Blitz to beverage is a myth. Politics and political programs are critical to innovation in welfare, as in everything else. And what's distinctive, it seems to me, about the present is that there is no serious political alternative to the Johnson government, a point I think we've seen illustrated unexpectedly, dramatically, by the abysmal failure of the Labour Party to present an alternative to the new health and social care provisions. And that said, the politicization of the economy, Brexit and COVID, opens a new front of pressure on government to come up with more nationalistic solutions. Save the steel industry, to reinforce the funding of the NHS. But what will happen in the medium term seems to me to be unclear. What is clear is that we do not have a government that is ideologically committed to or planning for a new nationally focused reconstruction. Now, in this context, a fresh national critique based on new framings does have the potential to be politically useful, as well as laying the basis for such a program. But it needs, I think, to be fresh in at least two ways. First, it needs to reject the standard old left nationalist critique, which I think is central to British left politics, which focuses on the supposed continuities in the British state, economy, and society from the Edwardian years. And it needs to focus instead on an analysis and critique of what has happened since 1979, and indeed since 1997. And secondly, and I've learned a lot on this from Williams and the national economy discussions, it needs new metrics, new concepts, and new ambitions. And I would add a new history to sustain it as well. One of the most striking features of what's happened from 1979 and reinforced after 1997 was that the idea of the nation as a democratic collectivity of real people has disappeared from English politics, and from what James has said, perhaps from Scottish politics as well. The political nation has ceased to care much about a large proportion of the population, and thinks first of the wealthy as investors and wealth creators. The rest of the population is not made up of workers, but of entrepreneurs and small businesses. There is no working class, but instead something called hard-working families, or the squeezed middle, and now a fantastical reactionary red wall. Putting a real national collectivity, the one we all know is out there, not least that of producers, workers, employees, trade unions, into a new political imaginary would represent a fundamental step forward. And it's interesting to note in this context that it's workers, including aged workers, over 66 workers, that are to be subject to a new tax to pay for adult social care, and in fact, mostly for the NHS. And has been said many times today, the richest rentiers are exempt. We have here a politics focused on old Tory voters, also Brexit voters, which is to be sustained by the taxation of workers. And note again, the incapacity of Labour to provide an alternative vision. It merely complains that taxes for workers, and that word is creeping in, are going up. Nothing more than that. Now, Carol Williams rightly impressed on me that remaking the nation involves rethinking the statistical and other yardsticks that are in place. We need to get away from a framing which rewards bads as well as goods, degrading the quality of life as well as its improvement. In other words, we need at the very least to augment GDP measures. But thinking through the national in statistical and other ways is essential, it seems to me, to developing and operationalizing a social democratic politics. The essence of social democratic politics is a national calculus, which allows one to focus simultaneously on efficacy, efficiency, and equality. And social democracy, if it means anything at all, means, I think, that these three go together rather than being in conflict, but can only be developed in a self-reinforcing way through collective action by a national state, which can take on private and sectoral interests. In this view, that the state can and should act to create a national community whose members become more like each other economically, socially, than they would under the rule of property. In this framing, the state might act to ensure a high national floor of income and access to services, thing we've been discussing today, and to reduce inequalities of income, wealth, and also geographical. And to do so not just for its own sake, but because it means that efficiency and efficacy would also increase in this model. And indeed, if we think about how the NHS used to be thought of, it was thought of as the most effective, efficient, and efficacious way of organizing healthcare for the whole nation. It was not thought of as taxing and spending, at least not on the left. Precisely the objection of the Social Democrats was that that healthcare thought of nationally resulted in potentially better health outcomes and economic outcomes than if you thought about it as a tax and spend issue. And it's interesting to reflect on Anna and Susan's presentations earlier. And I think they were, in effect, arguing for a proper social democratic calculus, one very different from the emphasis on mere financial efficiency, which leads very directly to low wages and precarity, for example, in the social care sector. I suppose what I'd say, not in response, but in addition to what they said, was that kind of thinking was much more common in the past than it is today, and that it requires a new kind of politics. It's never going to be merely a technical exercise. That is, in many ways, too obvious to state, but nevertheless worth restating. From what I've been saying, I hope it's clear that the argument I've been making is not one for recreating a more generous welfare state. And this is where a bit of history comes in useful. It's wrongly believed that Labour's fundamental historical programme was one of creating a welfare state. Yet if one looks at Labour manifestos, the centrality of welfare only pops up in 1959, Hugh Gaitskell's manifesto, and then between 1997 and 2015. Tax and spend is not a historical Labour policy, it is the policy of the Labour right. Of course, the idea that welfare is a good thing in itself is deeply dubious. As has been already said, huge sums are spent, or at least implied today, the huge sums are spent today on subsidizing low wages. It's not a good thing in itself. So what was Labour in the past if it wasn't the party of welfare? Well, it was the party of production, of the transformation of the economy, of work, a party concerned with creating richer lives and richer communities. And I think this could usefully be recovered and indeed broadened to involve a new politics, not just of production, but of products, of services, of technology. And a very good example of this is a set of ideas around reconceptualizing the foundational economy. And the reason I point that I do think the foundational economy idea represents an extremely powerful challenge to standard political economic programs of both left and right. The difficulty, one important difficulty about thinking nationally is that invocations of the nation tend to send chills through the hearts of the informed left, and for very good reasons. And I want to suggest that a new politics of national reconstruction needs to focus on some things and not on others. I want to suggest, first of all, that it does not involve, as some on the Labour front bench, I think, want to at least have us hear, economic nationalism and protectionism or self-sufficiency. I don't think there's any possibility of a self-sufficient British economy. The EU, China, and the USA can be reasonably self-sufficient, but strategic autonomy, to use the EU phrase, does not imply self-sufficiency, especially not for the United Kingdom or any potentially independent part of it. Indeed, I want to suggest that a properly national, refreshed national focus will steer us away from conventional economic nationalist arguments. First of all, we need to move away from ideas of industrial strategy focused on glamorous, high-tech, tradable sectors. As has been suggested, we need an industrial strategy for social care more than we need an industrial strategy for let us say, hydrogen-powered aviation. We need to think very carefully, as the foundational economy approach teaches us, about the great bulk of the economy that is not internationally traded. And we need to recognize, therefore, that many of the worst problems of low wages and precarity are found precisely in non-international traded service sectors. Policy, not globalization, is the fundamental issue. The politics of self-sufficiency are also dangerous in that they imply, and I used to imply, that British is good and foreign bad. But we need to recognize that whole sectors of the British economy are now foreign owned. That a company like Siemens manufactures in the UK, whereas a supposedly British company like Dyson does not. Furthermore, we need to note that British business, much of it concerned with extracting rents and sending them to tax havens, is itself a major problem for British economy and society. Indeed, there's a very great danger that by focusing on British, focusing on high tech, focusing on international competitiveness, will go down two roads that have been tried before and lead nowhere good. The first is a nationalistic focus on higher defense spending and nationalist procurement, a live danger, it seems to me, but it leads to the UK being once again Europe's upper volta with rockets. The second trap is the temptation to overinvest in high technology in the belief that the UK has exceptional strengths in science and technology when it doesn't. We actually need a politics of informed and careful imitation rather than innovation. And I think here we need to reflect critically that on the fact that the very techie British approach to COVID has not overall been a great success. Mass testing and tracing without tracing and without isolation, mass testing with lateral flow tests of dubious precision have not done very much, whereas the failure to organize society appropriately, to act quickly, has had devastating negative effects. And we have now indeed what seems to me a striking failure to get the young sufficiently vaccinated. So we need a policy of making the country better rather than one of falsely claiming to be best. We should embrace, I think, an old social democratic politics, but in the context of belief that England, at least, should be a modest nation, one that certainly has much to be modest about. We need to rescue our politics, and this has happened, I think, to some extent in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, from the damaging delusions of global grandeur that so inform our discourse. And we need a vision of the nation as a democratic collectivity of real people, producers, consumers, and citizens. Socialist and social democratic programs require national thinking, but with a critical proviso that most nationalist thinking is neither social democratic nor socialist. I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot, David. Now I'll give the floor to Kevin Morgan for a Welsh perspective on the topic. Please, Kev.
Many thanks to James and David for two extremely engaging and indeed provocative presentations. I need to respond as I've just heard them. I saw some of James's slides earlier, but I've only just heard David's presentation, obviously. So in 5 or 10 minutes, let me just offer, for what it's worth, an immediate response, trying to distill some of the implications for Wales and beyond. Beginning first with James. I thought it was absolutely right, James, to stress the significance of the prosaic. This is absolutely vital and goes right to the heart, I think, of foundational economy perspectives. And, you know, with respect to the foundational economy, I'm delighted, for reasons we can talk about later, if you want, that the Welsh government and Welsh civil society were one of the first, if not the first, to officially embrace a foundational perspective in its developmental strategy. So that's a real first for Wales that they can take some genuine comfort from, it seems to me. But the point you made about the constitutional framing of political life in Scotland is exactly the same as Wales. And if, sadly, Richard Wynne-Jones is ill, sadly, we wish him a speedy recovery. But if Richard was here, I dare say that he'd want to emphasize the fact that this is also the prism through which so much is framed, and how people in Wales, particularly the political elite, views and values things through these constitutional lenses, if you will. And it's a very narrow framing. And what it lacks being earthed in or linked to what we used to call bread and butter issues, the foundational economy issues, health, education, dignified elder care, food, and the like. And the problem again in Scotland and in Wales is that the political elite tends to think that the passing of legislation is tantamount to having done the job, when that's the beginning rather than the start. And I welcome looking back to the work of John Mackintosh, who I also was a great admirer of. But the key thing that I wanted to pull out, James, from your presentation, which I think is pertinent to what how David ended his presentation, and how it helps us to reframe a new politics, a new set of more consequential metrics, is your distinction between a performative politics and policy performance, meaning real world outcomes in schools, in hospitals, in care homes, in local economies, to see tangible changes that men and women can see that resonating in their real lives. And this, for me, is the biggest challenge of all. And I would say, I'll come back to this when commenting on David's presentation. In terms of that new politics of substance, as opposed to purely performativity, I would say that the best example of such a politician in the UK today is actually Mark Drakeford. As Richard Wynne-Jones said so elegantly in The Guardian this week, that he was not only an anti-charismatic politician, almost by design, not that anything is designed and affected in Drakeford. Drakeford is the real deal. He is, anyone who has spent time with him knows, he is an authentic person who listens a lot and then distills an argument. And people are impressed with him when they meet him, but he doesn't play that charismatic game. And I think that's what began to resonate for people when they saw him as a trustworthy steward of the nation during COVID. And therefore, I'll come back to this in a moment. But the key point I wanted to emphasize, James, about your distinction, performativity versus performance on the ground, is the implementation gap in Scotland and in Wales. This, for me, is the major theme of 20 years of devolution. The disconnect between laudable ambitions and aspirations on the one hand, and on the other hand, the inability for a whole series of reasons to deliver, to meet those aspirations. And I guess the best example in Wales, of course, is our world-class legislation in terms of the well-being of future generations legislation, with its 7 outstandingly globally resonant goals on the one hand, and our inability to implement policies on the ground that deliver and meet these goals. And I just wanted to emphasize one point, that part of the problem in delivering is the performance of a political elite in the Welsh government, whereby co-production is a genuine challenge. And like charity, co-production begins at home. So co-production for me would start within Welsh government itself, where Welsh government departments behave less like silos, organized hierarchically as they have been for hundreds of years, and start to begin to frame policies in a genuinely, in that horrible phrase, in a joined up or holistic manner. That's where co-production would begin. And then they would learn to work less hierarchically with civil society partners. And that would be real co-production to help us to deliver on the issues that you mentioned in terms of those prosaic issues, what I call the old bread and butter issues. So that's a challenge for both Wales and Scotland, how to build a policy performance capability, which we might sum up in terms of co-production. Those are some issues, I think, that go to the heart of the foundational challenge in and beyond Wales. Turning quickly to David's presentation, which I'm sorry, I was going to say less adequate, not that my response to you, James, was sufficiently adequate, but I've just heard David's presentation, and it begins in this very challenging way by addressing and puncturing 3 rhetorics. the Brexit rhetoric, the levelling up rhetoric, and the COVID rhetoric. And there's something rich to be debated within each of those, as he said. On the Brexit rhetoric, I believe that the core components will end up to be inconsequential in terms of delivering real tangible benefits, whether they are free trade agreements, whether they are free ports, or whether they are superpower claims, whether it's about science or innovation. And it's worth saying that we are genuinely a superpower in terms of science, but we are far from being a superpower in terms of innovation, because that claim elides the difference between invention and innovation. We have big problems in terms of innovation, even though we've done relatively well on science. I think in terms of the COVID rhetoric, I would have liked David to hear what David thought of COVID reactions in each of the nations. David talked about the British reaction, but when you unpick the reactions, we see radically different things going on. Just as an example, Johnson was untrusted by the English population for large swathes of the COVID, of the pandemic, still going on, of course. Sturgeon did much better, but I would argue Drakeford did even better. And there was a tangible difference in the way in which the publics in Scotland and Wales reacted to their first ministers. Just to take one example that David mentioned, if you unbundle the national reactions to PPE, test and trace, overall performativity, we see Wales performing much better than England on PPE, no scandals, for example, quite efficient PPE performance. On test and trace, it was chalk and cheese. Wales performed better and cheaper than England did on test and trace. Why? Because we were more polycentric. We worked with local authorities. We worked with local intelligence of local public health boards. In terms, we tapped a collective intelligence and we did not centralize any of our reactions. I think this will come out in the wash when we see the great reckonings, and PhDs will be written on these things in the future. This brings me finally to where I suspect David and I differ most of all. I should preface this by saying I was a great admirer, David, of your recent book, Rise and Fall of the British Nation, even though I'm still gobsmacked, as you might imagine, by the title. I can't imagine anyone based in Scotland or Wales writing that book with that title, because the British nation begs so much. And I know why you did it, you explain it very well, but this, I've simply got a mental blockage, I guess, about that title. But I do agree with your presentation. We do need to reframe our politics, our narratives, and our metrics, as you said. And I would suggest, for the sake of argument, but I also believe it, I would suggest that we have the makings of this new politics, the new metrics and the new narrative in the discussions we've been having here over the last 2 days. First of all, about what the foundational economy means, and indeed what it could mean. In the wonderful presentations we had this morning from our 4 speakers, particularly from Anna Coote, who spoke about the social guarantee that was both radical and pragmatic in terms of what a universal basic service, the essentials, as she called it, would mean for the way in which we think about politics and campaign, and which brings us back to James's point about less about performative politics and more about policy performance on the ground. I think this is where the way we should go. And the big question, I think, for all of us, even if we differ on the nuances, the big question is, who and where are the agents of change? What are the new political alliances that we could begin to craft that could further this new agenda. I think the foundational economy is part of that. Why? Because it helps us to craft together the increasingly polycentric nature of the British political landscape. We live in a polycentric state, despite the muscular unionism coming out from Johnson's government. And the real merit of the foundational economy for me is that it offers everywhere, everyone, everywhere, something. And that helps to build a common citizenship across our nations and our regions. And that's why politically, the foundational economy is such a compelling political narrative. I'll stop there, Filippo.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Well, given the richness of your comment, I would like to, before giving space to, can you hear me? Yes, okay. Before giving space to some questions, I would like to give the floor again to David and James for a quick reply, given, I mean, the richness of your comments. So in the reverse order, maybe. So first David and then James. Please, David.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. Yes, lovely. On the COVID response, absolutely, mea culpa. That was a slip of the tongue. Indeed, I was up in Scotland very recently. It was very striking. People were wearing masks at almost university, which is absolutely not the case here. So forgive me for that one. I was trying to be careful for the rest of the talk, and I lost it at that point. On your point about the foundational economy, I hope you didn't read me as saying anything other than what you said. Like you, I absolutely believe that this is radical and important, and exactly the way we need to go. On your point about the rise and fall of the British nation, I think you're wrong. I don't think it's a book that could be written from within the standard analyses of Britain that exist in England. In fact, I think it was much more likely that somebody from Wales or Scotland would write the book I wrote than the great majority of English people. But that may be a semantic problem about the title that's at work here. But thank you for your point.
James, please.
The one point I was going to pick up on that Kevin made was about the polycentric nature of the UK, and I think that's a hugely important point. I would stress also the polycentric nature, and Kevin alluded to this in talking about Wales, of the component parts, that one of the great failings of devolution, I think arguably one of the main, if not the biggest failing, has been the degree of centralisation that we've seen in Scotland, because the assumption had been that we would have moved in that kind of Macintosh direction to decentre across the board, and that local government would be revived. And local authorities in Scotland, 20 plus years ago, looked to the Scottish Parliament to change the relationship they had with central government. And that simply hasn't happened. And indeed, in the last few years, we've seen an acceleration of that centralisation. And I think also in terms of the pandemic, the impact, I think one of the things that I think has been successful has been at the very local level. When I was talking about that, the kind of positive things and the same things that Stephen Boyle was talking about, is at that very local level. At the national level, and i.e. the Scottish level in this case, I think it's been a mixed bag. And I think in terms of the kind of transfer of older people from hospitals into care homes, it's been a disaster in Scotland as much as the rest of the UK. I mean, the deaths caused has been horrendous here, so we haven't been any more successful. I think in some other areas it's been successful. Where I think Nicola Sturgeon's greatest strength is as a communicator. She is, I think, the greatest communicator. You've maybe got the best First Minister in Wales, but we've got the best communicator in Scotland, I think. And she's very convincing. And I think, it's no surprise that she has dominated the communication and these almost daily press conferences and so on and so forth. But I think when you look behind it, it's a bit of a mixed bag. And as I say, I think one of the central points is the that we have neglected that kind of polycentric nature that we need to embrace within Scotland in the way that you mentioned has been happening in Wales, which I think fits with what we were saying earlier. The other thing I should have, I neglected comments on the Scottish economy and such like. I could have talked about some of the things there, and having heard David, I really feel like I ought to have said something about that, because ultimately, I think one of the things post-devolution is that the issue of the Scottish economy has taken very much a backseat in debates, and that cannot last because of the new powers of the Parliament. The state of the Scottish economy will matter in terms of public finances in a way it didn't previously, because in the past we just got the bung from London, and it was the UK economy that we that needed to prosper. Now it will be the Scottish economy, and that's going to make a big difference, and we're going to have to pull our socks up significantly, especially if we want to keep spending the money that we like spending in Scotland.
Thanks. Yes, can you hear me now? Okay, thanks. Thank you. So now the floor is open for questions and comments. You can jump in or raise your hand as you wish. I don't see the chat.
Yeah, Caroline has got her hand up.
Hi, yeah, Caroline Lloyd from Cardiff University. Thanks, I found those talks really fascinating. Sorry I missed this morning, but I'd just like to pick up on the last thing that Kevin's mentioned, which was about agents of change. And where do you see the agents of change coming from? I mean, if we think about, I think it was James was talking about social democracy, and we look at social democratic countries, Scandinavian, in particular the role of organised labour and trade unions in the formation and pushing forward in social democracy and left political parties. Given the state of the Labour Party, the role of trade unions currently across the UK, where do you see agents for change within this and to change the political agenda, the state? Where is our hope coming from? Because it all looks a bit dismal to me.
Thanks. It's a key problem also in Italy.
Can I quickly respond?
Who wants to answer? Kevin, maybe first, and then yes, Kev.
Thanks, Caroline. I think that this is, for me, the quintessential question about all our work. How do we create more consequential politics that have real impacts in people's lives? And if I simply reflect on the way in which the foundational network has emerged in Wales, the moving spirits haven't mainly come from party politics, though certain politicians in Labour and Plaid Cymru have contributed, not least, of course, Lee Waters, who concludes our conference tomorrow. In my mind, Lee Waters has been the most important party politician in terms of acting as an ambassador for the concept and for enabling change to happen within Welsh Government. But Welsh Government has played, in other ways, has played a following role as intermediaries in civil society, whether they're registered social landlords, housing associations, working with other civil society groups. These are the people who have come together initially to create a bandwagon effect. This is, in my own mind, how I see it. So party politics, unlike what I think Anna Coote said this morning, is almost irrelevant. I see them having a role to play once we've mobilised a new kind of framing of politics on the ground. And this is very place-based politics in particular areas with particular constellations of civil society groups. The local state is important, and then the national state comes in to foster rather than frustrate these new currents. But I'm not looking to the Labour Party initially to be the main agent for change, for all the reasons David Edgerton said so well.
Thank you. David or James, you want to add something? David?
Yes, I perhaps add that, of course we do have very powerful agents of change in the Conservative Party and in business, and they've been in the driving seat for a long time and continue to be there. So I think one of the things that you do is just recognise that simple point. And for a long time, people on the left of British politics have assumed that conservative forces were simply reactive to progressives, and that's simply not true. And many of the great initiatives that have transformed the UK have in fact come from the right. So we need to look at that. I mean, so I think we do have a very particular kind of politics, but given what I was saying about democratization, I think there are all sorts of opportunities for new kinds of politics, as the legitimacy of the old politics is shrinking. And I think Wales and Scotland are positive examples, despite reservations that James and Kevin have very rightly expressed. And indeed, I hope I think one of the most positive things that could happen for English politics is the independence of Scotland and the secession of Northern Ireland. I think one of the great problems is this issue of the delusions of grandeur. And I mentioned this only just to respond to a point that Kevin made that I forgot to respond to earlier, which is that, alas, I don't think the UK is a science superpower. Obviously, it is an innovation superpower, but nor is it a science superpower. It is more productive than one would expect in terms of population and so on. But then so is Switzerland, so is the United States, so are a lot of places. It's definitely not a superpower. It might be one of 5 or 6 top players, but that's what we need to recognize. There isn't a sort of there isn't a kind of elixir of life waiting to be tapped in our universities.
I guess in terms of agents of change in Scotland, I mean, I think there are numerous agents of change, and I come across them all the time at local level and in particular public services. A lot of the people, I've done a lot of work over the years in justice areas, and I think of the kind of the violence reduction unit that was established by Strathclyde Police that's now been used in London. And at that level, I think there are lots of people going on doing these things. I think the political parties, we have to look to whether we like it or not, we have to look to the political parties. And I think one of the problems is that the political parties have changed over time. They're much more controlled by the leadership. I think one of the most remarkable changes that I've witnessed in Scotland has been in the SNP, which was once a fairly anarchic political party with lots of ideas. I mean, an SNP conference and debates were fascinating and quite exciting, and often quite bloody on the floor of the conference. Today, they're just so controlled. And I think that controlling actually inhibits debate, discussion, and inhibits, or at least pushes that into the shadows. And I think we need to take it out of the shadows. And again, I think the kind of poly-centric point comes out. We need to have a much more open system, and so much innovation has often come from the local level. I think that we do need in Scotland to open it up, and I think the ideas, they are there. And again, I would echo in many respects the point David just made with respect to Scotland. I think some of the ideas that are emerging from think tanks and so on are coming very much from the right. I mean, there are very few think tanks in Scotland, but the few that exist are often lobbyists as well, and they're not progressive in any shape or form. And I think that's a challenge. And I think one of the biggest weaknesses and one of the really abiding problems we've got has been the decline of the trade unions. We used to talk in Scotland about the trade union movement was the political wing of the Labour movement, rather than the Labour Party being the political wing. And of course, that's a movement that's been really undermined over many years, decades now.
Great, thanks. Thank you. We still have something like 10 more minutes, I guess. So other questions or comments are welcome, please. I know that Kevin has to leave in 5 minutes. Yes, Ian, please. I see Ian Jones, please.
Thanks, Filippo, and great thanks to James and David for really fascinating talks. I was very interested in James's comment about metrics, and this is just a plug. I know Carol and Julie wrote with colleagues a really, I thought, important piece on what went wrong with the NHS prior to COVID, which illustrates very neatly that the obsession with efficiency, bed occupancy, discharge rates meant that there was no buffering in the system. So just throwing this out there, James, and it relates to Kevin's point about FE being about the prosaic, that maybe we need to rethink, and have a more nuanced approach to metrics, and maybe throw the green book out and start campaigning for something very different. So I'd welcome your thoughts on that. And then David, I mean, the other thing, I loved your book, David. I really enjoyed it. Now, I agree also with your comment that the techie approach failed in the UK during COVID. And it really set me thinking about where's the response to a sustainable economy here within your critique of the British state. So we hear a lot about a Green New Deal from all sides of the political divide, but given that perhaps we're still in a warfare state, what are the possibilities for moving towards a more green and sustainable state?
I don't know if you want me to come first, but on the metrics, I very much am sympathetic with that. Sorry, I think that the point about the metrics in the NHS is really important, and it applies across the board in so many areas. I'm also reminded of something that my friend John Carnahan, who set up the violence reduction unit in all these years ago, he often says that we're really good at hitting the targets but missing the point, and I think that's often the case. We can't just dismiss metrics, however, and I think it's getting that balance right, and I think we've gone the wrong way, and we use metrics in a way I think that's not helpful, because metrics is just evidence, but the evidence is plural, and it's often contradictory, and we need to take that into account and acknowledge that in what we do. I think one of the things that was done by the Scottish Government in 2007 was to introduce the National Performance Framework, which was an interesting innovation, and in a sense a good idea, because it tried to get away from the crude metrics approach, but actually over time it has just become an old style metrics measurement, and I think that's a great disappointment. And I sometimes very much of the view that we just get rid of them all, but I know that that's not going to happen. But I do think we need to have a much more nuanced approach and a much greater willingness to acknowledge that actually sometimes what counts can't be counted, and that really, if you want to get change, it will take time. I mean, a lot of the kind of changes we need will not be done overnight, and no single policy intervention is going to achieve many of the things we want to achieve. And it's the relationship between different interventions and overall context. And I think that requires a kind of more sophisticated politics than the type of politics I was talking about earlier. And it's so easy and so tempting for our politicians. And in a sense, I often say, and I talk to all the political parties and do presentations to them all, I often say, I get where you're coming from. I'm not seeking election to anything. I'd never be elected to anything. And I get why you're doing it, but you need to try and change that. And everybody privately agrees it's getting that change that's the really difficult thing.
David, you want to add something?
Yes, on the green issue, I think actually that the danger is that that governments talk up the kind of high-tech solutions to climate change as a cover for not doing the prosaic but essential things. I mean, we could reduce carbon emissions tomorrow massively without any technical change whatsoever. If we all drove 2 CVs around the place, especially with modern engines of that size, we'd make a massive dent on CO2 emissions. But alas, we have the politics of Britain leading the world in batteries. We have £3 million for hydrogen aviation. This is all nonsense, but it's politically very powerful nonsense that the left buys into as much as the right. So I think this is a classic case where we just need to forget any supposed British superpowerdom and recognise that the way forward is going to be changing what we can already change and importing things, whether it's solar panels or wind turbines. The last thing we want is to innovate and distract ourselves from the solutions that are obviously there already. But that does need a new kind of politics. So the temptation is precisely to go on about British genius rather than getting anything done.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. We still have we have 5 minutes left because we plan to finish up past 3. So we have 5 minutes left for last question or comment, if any. No.
Can I make a point on that green point? I mean, in the Scottish context, because it's quite interesting. We've now got a deal that's been agreed between the SNP and the Scottish Greens, and it really is interesting to look at the agreement. And it's a fairly lengthy agreement, and in the main bulk, which it talks about where there is agreement, because there's 2 parts to it. There's the where they agree and where they agree to disagree. On the main part, it talks a great game about sustainable economic development, circular economy, and all the rest of it. It's really sounds great. It sounds great. And then you look at the bit which is excluded from the deal, and it talks about GDP and all the rest of it. We're not going to agree on all these things. And I think one of the problems is that these 2 elements are not being brought together. And in a sense, it comes back to the point I was trying to make earlier about the performative nature versus performance. And I think that the tensions are there. And in a sense, even with this deal, this agreement between these 2 political parties, it hasn't been confronted realistically, but it is worth looking at. But the crucial thing in looking at the deal is to get the long document and the short document, because the long document doesn't include the annex where they disagree. That's only in the short document, which is strange, but there we have it.
Interesting.
Okay, David, you want to add something, or is that okay?
That's okay.
Okay, so sorry. Right, so well, we have 3 minutes, so if there is a quick last question or comment, it's welcome. No? Okay, I don't see anyone. Okay, so I think we can stop here, and thanks a lot for this very interesting session. As usual, as in the tradition of the foundational economy, we always mix analytical insights and political framing, because this is one of the specificity of the foundational economy program. So this session was very much in line with this slant. Okay, so thanks a lot, and thanks for being here with us, and have a good day. Bye bye.